Even today, Bloodborne remains one of the most beloved games on PS4. With its dark aesthetic and brilliant level design, it's one of the best games in the system. But it has its fair share of technical faults as well. Last week, however, I witnessed the game running at a full 60 frames per second, and had to know more. So I reached out to the man responsible for modding the game, Lance McDonald, and he joins us here today on Digital Foundry. So welcome, Lance.
Hey, how you doing, John? It's good to be here.
And it's good to have you here. You've done a lot of great stuff for the Bloodborne and general Souls community, and these sort of going behind the scenes videos, and you have a lot of great stuff over on your channel, and I've always enjoyed it, so I'm glad that you can finally join us here to discuss one of the best discoveries yet.
Yeah, no, it's an absolute pleasure.
So I guess before we get into the discussion of how and why and all that, let's set the stage to understand the Bloodborne situation again for the audience. So this is a game designed for the base PlayStation 4. It operates at 1080p and it's capped at 30 frames per second. But of course, anybody that's played the game, it has kind of become the poster child for bad frame pacing, as we know it. Or basically, the game averages out to 30 frames per second, but the amount of time that a frame persists on screen varies. So instead of being every frame is 33 milliseconds, you might have one that's 16, one that's 33, then another that's 50. And this variation causes a visible stutter in the image. But so this is actually something that's persisted with all of their games kind of since as well. And with Dark Souls 3 and Sekiro, I guess they actually unlocked the frame rate on the Pro consoles. And that showed us that, okay, well, once you remove that cap, you can eliminate this problem, but those systems didn't have enough juice, or the game was designed in such a way that you couldn't actually hit a stable 60 FPS. But what you've done here is actually sort of overcome that in some interesting ways. And we're going to go through different sort of modes that you've tested here, starting with, I think, the best one, and that is the 720p mode.
So obviously this is, as far as I'm concerned, my new favorite way to play the game. So I've gone ahead and rolled the frame buffer back to 720p, but put a new upper limit on the frame rate, which is, of course, 60 frames per second. And then I've had to go so far as to use the PlayStation 4's boost mode to actually make it, as good as possible. But with that done, I personally think the results are absolutely, unquestionably better than what was in the shipping product for Bloodborne.
Yeah, for sure. And actually, you mentioned boost mode, and that's interesting. So here's some performance analysis I did for footage you captured running with the frame rate cap removed at 720p, but in base mode. So this is how it would run on the base PS4. And as you can see, it's not stable at all. It does not actually manage to get to 60 FPS.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because obviously base mode is what From Software assumed the PlayStation 4 would always be. So they obviously tested this in-house. They said, well, how high can we get the frame rate if we were to sacrifice some resolution? And this is what they would have seen, and they, I think, made the right decision and said, no, this is not good enough. Because what you see on a base console with an uncapped frame rate, even at 720p, it's just not quite good enough in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. And I think in this case, the 1080p 30 decision is still the right one. That's, that is the target that makes the most sense. And the entire issue revolves around the way that they sort of capped the frame rate, which is bizarre.
Yeah, I think everything we say, it's with complete almost disregard for the fact that 30 frames per second is broken in Bloodborne. The frame pacing is bad, and it's just something that I'm not even sure From Software knew existed, let alone how to fix it. I think they just looked at the game, applied a cap in the way they knew how to do it, and shipped the product that way because it performed the way they wanted it to. So obviously, even if the 30 frames per second, we say, yes, that was the right choice, that's still with the caveat of it being slightly broken at the end of the day.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing is, if you look at, say, the developmental readouts here, you would see that they're hitting their target frame rate, no doubt. It's just that until you really look at the frame times and understand that inconsistency, which, not everybody does see this issue, right? Like, some people don't understand what we're talking about, and that's fair. So you would think that, oh, it's fine, but in reality it's not. So, but obviously, running in the base mode, especially if you're at like 1080p and you uncap the frame rate, it's not going to be a good experience either. It's still close to 30 frames per second, just a little bit above. So instead of that sort of judder you get from the bad frame pacing, you just get sort of just judder from, well, still inconsistent frame times. But the main thing here is obviously that now we have the PS4 Pro and we have boost mode. And now boost mode does offer a nice bump in performance. I think it's like a 31% boost to CPU and less than half that, or around half that for the GPU, if I recall. So you don't get the full performance of the PS4 Pro, but it's enough of a boost that it does kind of improve things. And right now we're actually looking at this is the 1080p mode with the frame rate cap disabled. And this one is still not great.
Yeah, so I think that was the first thing I tested with boost mode. Was I put a lot of work into uncapping the frame rate in the first place, and noticed it wasn't great at all on a base PlayStation 4. So I immediately moved over to boost mode, and it wasn't much better at 1080p. And I sort of lost hope at that point. I thought, look, the 30 frames per second cap is all we're really going to get here, because this is just an unstable mess. Even if From Software had have known that boost mode would someday exist, it wasn't something they were going to be able to target at 1080p. It's just completely unrealistic.
Yes, exactly. And then, along the way, you did also try 900p, which we'll talk about in a second. But I think it was the moment when you went all the way down to 720p. This is when you showed me the first real clip of it as well. And it was kind of like a light bulb moment where it's like, whoa, okay, this is actually really good.
Yeah, so that was... so switching it to 720p was the first resolution change I tried, because Demon's Souls was 720p. I've only ever played Dark Souls at 720p, and I thought, well, why not? What would be the problem with Bloodborne at 720p? I'm sure it looks fantastic. And I think it does. And immediately seeing the frame rate change and being fairly stable, I just was like, this is it. This is the product, ship it. This is exactly how I want this game to be presented, absolutely. And, in so many situations, it's a shocking change just to see 10 seconds of footage of Bloodborne running like this. It's jarring almost. It hurts to go back to a 30 frames per second cap, regardless of the resolution change. It's just very difficult to go back from that.
Absolutely. So obviously, when I see that, I'm thinking, okay, we need to see how this runs across the game. And this is where I kind of asked you, can you kind of run through the game, check out all the different major areas, and then I can take that footage, run it through our analysis tools, and we can get a better idea of how the game as a whole would hold up. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly.
And that's where things get really interesting. So it is variable, but I'd say looking at the footage as a whole, I'd say it's pretty good. So first of all, the best stuff, the boss fights, right? So this is just a single entity jammed into a simple arena sort of space. There's no need to load in new assets, really. Everything you need is right there. And those are likely, I guess, the most GPU reliant, and they don't really hammer the CPU in any significant way. And as a result, they're pretty much almost locked to 60, I'd say, with just occasional dips here and there. But, as you can see here, I've kind of went through different boss fights for the analysis tools based on the ones that you played through. And the results are really, really good.
Yeah, so the thing is, the boss fights are when the player's reaction time is tested the most. So they were the first thing I focused on. But the Father Gascoigne fight, which is in a graveyard, which is a fairly closed-in situation, I'm pretty sure that was a 60 frames per second lock. I mean, I don't particularly have an eye for it, but that whole boss fight, including the moment where he transforms into his beast form, and there's a lot of particle effects and some alpha effects on decals that cover the screen. Even that was very nicely smooth. I felt I could really feel the speed in that moment, and the massive upgrade that was happening there. And across many boss fights, the blood-starved beast at one point goes into a later phase, and it's covered in poison, and particle effects are going everywhere. And that was just a treat. Just seeing those particles move so smoothly, and it wasn't tanking the frame rate. Not that it ever did, it was always a solid 30, but seeing it at a solid or near solid 60 is just, it's a totally different experience. It's fantastic.
Absolutely. And so obviously seeing that, I'm thinking, all right, so what about the rest of the game? Actually moving through the world. And this is where things get a little more, I don't want to say dicey because the results are still good, but this is, this really tests the system. The main issue, as far as we can kind of tell here, I think, is that anything that sort of leans heavily on the CPU, specifically like uncompressing assets, streaming in new areas, that kind of stuff, does still have an impact on the overall frame rate, and I suppose that is why we see the most dips when simply traversing the environment at a relatively high speed. So some of these sections you're kind of running through pretty quickly, and that is when the game seems to choke. Not choke too severely, it's still mostly in the 50s, but that's when the frame rate seems to take a noticeable hit.
Yeah, I think there were some moments where I was indoors just turning a corner, and there really wasn't much going on at all, but there was a few frame dips just as the camera panned around the corner. And that's that time when it's pouring in assets as far as possible, because 4 rooms away, it's loading in some huge outdoor area that's made up of about 60 assets that are all compressed. The CPU has to work pretty hard to decompress them as fast as it can. So a lot of the frame dips were in moments when the player's reaction time doesn't even really matter that much, so it was quite a pleasant experience regardless, but you definitely do see quite a few of them just as you're sprinting from place to place, or just generally moving between maps, that sort of thing.
Exactly, so that's kind of situation 2. The third one then is tied more to the scenery itself. There seems to be certain areas where the frame rate just can't hit that 60 FPS level. Early on, there's like this cathedral area. When you're outside of it running around, you sort of get into the mid-50s. I think the heaviest area by far is this place later in the game, which is just, it's not nearly as smooth. So yeah, it's these different areas you visit just running through the world. Some of them are at 60 FPS, some of them aren't. And these are things I feel like if they were actually making a 60 FPS game or updating the game for that, there would be room to maybe optimize and change the way they're doing certain things, perhaps to further improve the overall level of performance. So the fact that we're seeing results this good just from the patchwork that you've done is really quite striking.
Yeah, I mean, we are seeing a game that was specifically created to run at 30 frames per second. That frame rate is embedded so deep in the game that if they had have actually targeted 60 or even a variable frame rate, I think they would have gone back and made a few little creative changes, such as differently structuring the way assets stream in just a few areas, or even changing the way some areas are laid out just to help meet that frame rate cap, or even just a higher frame rate. So we're basically just throwing more power than they ever expected at a lot of these scenes, and it's just choking a little in a way that they would just never have expected, and they can't be blamed for that. They just threw as many polygons into a scene as possible because, hey, it looks great, it runs great at 30 frames per second, why would we not make it look this way? And they can't be blamed for that. Of course, it's going to slow down just a little, yeah.
Exactly. Which brings us to the fourth sort of point of slowdown, and you mentioned throwing polygons around, and you are literally doing that, just throwing tons of enemies on the screen, attacks, whatever. It's this section in the forest here. So the forest is already more demanding, but when you throw in all these enemies in this scene here with the fire and everything going on, this seems to be the worst case scenario that you found, and this is the one that was most interesting. The worst I saw, actually, the absolute worst I saw was 39 frames per second for a split second, and before that it was 42. But in general, it still holds closer to around the 50-ish mark.
And at the end of the day, I was playing the game with all the debugging cheats turned on, sprinting into enemies and fire as fast as possible, and running off and shooting abhorrent beasts to trying to get them to follow me back to the rest of the pack. I was really trying to slam the console as hard as possible, and it was still a wonderful experience. But when you face that area in game, it's a very slow area. You carefully sneak up behind each enemy and kill them one at a time so you don't aggravate the whole pack. And you certainly don't go exploring and deliberately adding more enemies to the scene just to drive it into the ground. So what I did was a wonderful test of what the PlayStation 4 Pro in boost mode is capable of, and what the engine itself is capable of. But it wasn't a good representation of what playing through Bloodborne at 60 frames per second is like at all.
Exactly. And that's so you also tested then at 900p. And this puts it sort of into perspective because it scales exactly as you would expect. The difference between 720p to 900p to 1080p, you lose, say, a similar amount of performance with each resolution jump. And so I think hitting 720p, you're mostly overcoming the GPU limitations, I think, but a lot of it is still going to be CPU limited there, which you can't really overcome easily. But it is interesting because we actually considered dropping the resolution lower, and you said that didn't actually work.
Yeah, no, I think there's more work required. I think at the end of the day, the engine itself does have preset configurations that I was just tapping into, because it happily accepted 1080p, obviously, and it accepted 720p and 900p, but nothing I could think of between, below, or heaven forbid, above any of those would be accepted at all. The game would just crash immediately as soon as it started. So I think it's just set to accept those 3 resolutions, or it's something set by the PlayStation 4 that I don't fully understand.
Yeah, that's fair. And that's, this had me thinking then. So obviously we're running in boost mode here. We've seen what it can do. If they had created a proper, pro patch that could tap into the full power of it, I think we could get a lot closer, but you still run into that issue where, to get 60 FPS, you're talking resolutions below 1080p, which I think when the Pro was released wouldn't have been a good look for them. So I can certainly understand why that wouldn't have been the first choice. Even an aggressive dynamic resolution.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think people would have liked it, but.
Yeah, it would have been, I think, even with the full power of the PlayStation 4 Pro, using what they'd learned from Dark Souls 3 with its PlayStation 4 Pro patch, that sort of thing, bringing back a few enhancements to the Bloodborne engine, I think you still would have been seeing sub 1080p resolutions. And it was controversial enough when games like Tekken 7 and Nier Automata were 1080p on PlayStation 4 Pro, but a PlayStation 4 Pro patch that lowers the resolution even below that would have not been good for Sony. They would have thought, why is our new console making games look worse? That would have been the headlines. And it's just not something that I think we could have expected them to settle for.
Exactly, which is why, looking forward, I don't think it'll happen, because it seems they've left this game to rest. But it would be such a perfect candidate for a patch for PlayStation 5.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is a game that could easily get to 4K 60 locked. Given a little bit of development effort, targeting the PS5, I think that they could do it, and I think it would be an easy sell, in the sense that it shouldn't require too much staff time, much from the budget, and it would be a great chance to sort of re-release and refocus the game or something like that. This would be a great thing to have on PS5.
That's exactly right. We already know that the PlayStation 5 is going to have full support for original PlayStation 4 base mode, boost mode, and PS4 Pro mode, and it's going to add an enhanced mode as well beyond that. If they could just release a patch that unleashes every aspect of the engine, just let us go to 1080p or 4K if we're lucky, and just let us push as many frames per second as possible, let the PlayStation 5 backwards compatibility go as hard as possible and see how that goes. I think those would be amazing results.
It would be the kind of thing, Microsoft has been really good about pushing this with their backwards compatibility. I mean, they've had those 4K patches that introduce even HDR and things like that into 360 games. So just updating Bloodborne to support the PS5 at 4K 60, that alone would be such a huge win in terms of the goodwill towards consumers and fans of the series. I really think it would be a very smart decision for them to do. But, So I guess at this point then, we're getting a pretty good idea. The game does run a lot better. 720p 60 is the way to go. You did try some other variations, including disabling VSync and tweaking the frame rate cap. None of that stuff really solves the core issue, and it's just, It's a problem. But what I want to know, and I think, people watching would like to know more of, how did you come to solve this solution, and what are you doing to essentially achieve what we have here?
So this is something that I think a lot of people have leveraged against From Software upon seeing my work here. They've said, well, if it's so simple, why didn't From Software do this in the first place? And at the end of the day, it's just, this engine is so deeply tied to the 30 frames per second cap that it was shocking to see. Now, every version of this engine, all the way back to Demon's Souls, has had a 60 frames per second mode in it, which I've seen in Demon's Souls using the debug menu. I saw it in the Bloodborne alpha test using the debug menu. But switching those modes on would always make the entire game speed up. So if you managed to somehow hit 60 frames per second, all aspects of gameplay also ran twice as fast. So it was just incredibly hard to play. It was playing in fast forward because the whole engine is so deeply tied to that update speed. However, with Dark Souls 3, when it came to PC, and of course then got a PlayStation 4 Pro patch, they suddenly had the ability in this same engine to do arbitrary frame rates. It was no longer tied that way. When Dark Souls 3 does speed up to 45 frames per second, or whatever it does on PlayStation 4 Pro, it still works. It doesn't run too fast. So I took that Dark Souls 3 patch, the PlayStation 4 Pro one, and reverse engineered it to take a look at how the frame speed was working. And it was exactly the same as Bloodborne's 60 frames per second mode. All it does is just increase the 1 divided by 30 to 1 divided by 60. But for some reason it just works. And it turns out they actually went back through so many parts of the game engine where it had previously been coded to 1 divided by 30, and instead made it always use whatever the current frame rate is. It wasn't as simple as changing it to 1 divided by 60, because the game doesn't always run at 60. You can't just tell everything to always update at that speed. I had to continuously make it read what is the current frame rate, and use that as the update speed for the game engine, for starters, which made it so the actual game was playable at arbitrary speeds, including up to 60 frames per second. But as I played through it, it slowly became obvious how many more parts of the game engine were tied to that update speed. The first thing I noticed was blood splatter and alpha effects and particle effects were all hard tied to that speed, so I had to go through and patch more parts of the game engine, look at how Dark Souls 3 does it in the PlayStation 4 Pro patch, and then patch those changes back into Bloodborne. The speed that elevators work at, climbing up and down ladders, cloth update speed on some of the characters' outfits. There were so many parts of the game engine that were just hard tied to that update speed. It's been probably a couple of weeks now of very late nights going through Dark Souls 3, reverse engineering various parts of it, and comparing that to Bloodborne and seeing what are the differences here, which is not so hard because they use a very, very similar version of the same engine, but getting those patches into the code where it was previously just one line of code, it would be, update speed equals 1 divided by 30, and instead patching in a lot of code to read the current frame rate from a totally different part of the game engine and then write that into the cloth updating speed instead. It's very painful, and I can imagine that it wasn't a very easy thing for From Software to do. Of course, I don't have access to the original source code for Bloodborne. Maybe it would be easier if they had that, of course. But from the perspective I was looking at it, with it just being reverse engineering a game and looking at it all as x86 assembly, it's a very painful process, and there are still a lot of bugs in it at the moment that remain to be fixed. But by looking back at Demon's Souls, Dark Souls 1, the Bloodborne alpha test, the Dark Souls 3 network test, and all of these other games that have existed before it, I was able to learn how the engine has changed over time and backport some of those improvements from the newer games into Bloodborne, and that's the result we have there.
And, you said, why didn't From do this? And I think it's not so much that they couldn't have done it, as evidenced with Dark Souls 3. I just think, Bloodborne was kind of not the thing at the moment, and if you really wanted to hit that frame rate target like we're seeing here, you would have to rely on lowering the resolution, which didn't make sense at the time. So basically, because of that, there was kind of no way that they would have touched this on the PS4 Pro, outside of maybe introducing something like Dark Souls 3 Pro mode, but still. it's thanks to you that we actually have this then. So
Yeah, exactly. It's an interesting proposition because From Software, I assume, were tasked with porting Dark Souls 1 to PC, and you would think in a case like that they would have looked at increasing the frame rate in that case if it wasn't too hard a job, but of course the PC port of Dark Souls 1 was terrible and locked at 30 frames per second. So there's a bit to think about with regard to what they were willing to do, what they were able to do easily, and just how they approach game design and engine design as well. They may have just made some creative choices, I'm really not too sure.
And this is very old school Japanese game design, where there's a lot of hard-coded timings and values in there that are tied directly to the frame rate. That's how things used to be. Obviously these days, game logic and rendering and everything's decoupled and you can run at arbitrary frame rates. That's kind of the way to do it now. But some of these Japanese developers, like From Software, have kind of stuck with the old way for some reason and continued to sort of hard code in those values, and everything's very strangely timed and written in a way that's it's a little bit it's odd, but I guess if that's the way you've always done it and it kind of works for the target you're hitting on a console, it's not the end of the world. It just
It's something you see in a lot of console games going back forever, where so much of the game is tied to the crystal oscillation speed on the Super Nintendo or anything like that. And you used to be able to overclock your Super Nintendo and everything would go haywire, because this is just what they grew up with, the game design theory and engine design theory they've always had. And of course you do that. The PlayStation 4 is a closed system. No one's going to be increasing their CPU speed ever. Why would you not rely on the clock always equaling this exact speed? But things are changing and people are expecting different things, and developers are slowly catching up with that, and that's what we're seeing.
But yeah, I think that's pretty good stuff. Unfortunately, obviously, this is something that's done with debug, hacked, and other such PS4 systems. So I don't think that this is going to be a widely available thing, unfortunately, but it does give us a taste of what's possible.
That's exactly right. The PlayStation 4 is, of course, a closed system, and every day we hope that it becomes more open, depending on what happens. And of course, the PlayStation 4 generation is coming to a close. Maybe we'll see new things happen soon. But for the time being, this is only available to people who are able to run unsigned code on their PlayStation 4, which is an incredibly small percentage of Bloodborne fans, I'm fairly certain. But it would be really nice if things change a bit in the future. The best result, of course, being an official patch from Sony. It would be great if we used what I've done here as a way to show Sony how much we really want to see that happen. This needs to be a vector for us to share this and say, look, we really want this. This would be almost a system seller for the PlayStation 5 if you just dropped that patch for Bloodborne. That would just be fantastic.
Definitely. I fully agree, and I hope we will see Bloodborne revisited. But I think that's going to do it for this one. Everybody should have a pretty good idea of how it runs now. Looks pretty great. So thanks for all your hard work on this, Lance. And why don't you let everybody know where we can find you?
Yeah, so I usually put my work on Twitter at ManFightDragon. And of course, if you just type Lance McDonald into YouTube, you'll find some showcases of the work I've done from Bloodborne and a few other PlayStation 4 exclusives like PT as well, and God of War soon.
Oh, that's right. You did a lot of those camera tricks with PT, and I love that stuff. It's great. So yeah, go check his work out. It's really interesting stuff that gives a lot of insight into the way these games are put together, and we love that kind of stuff. But if you guys enjoyed this video, as always, be sure to give us a like and subscribe and ring that notification bell for instant updates from Digital Foundry. And of course, come follow us both over on Twitter. And until next time, I guess keep on playing Bloodborne or waiting for a patch.